for your attention. We're starting the celebration. Hello, welcome everyone to the first event in the Society of Fellows of the Hyman Center in the Humanities. We're launching off the semester with a celebration of the new books in the Society of Fellows. My name is Maria González. I am a current fellow here at the Society, and I'm introducing a wonderful panel of authors and respondents. I'd like to thank the respondents especially for your time and your comments and your contribution to the evening in the name of the Hyman Center and the Society of Fellows, and sharing your thoughts on these three wonderful new books, all authored by former fellows in the Society of Fellows in the Humanities. And I have to say, it's always the case with these events, but it's quite captivating to see how the three books not only are wonderful in their objects of study, all related to visual culture today and the arguments that you propose, but how they speak to each other, coming from different disciplines and from different fields. And I think that the conversation is going to be fascinating, at least as far as I'm concerned, to see this happen across the table. And it's also interesting for me to see, at least, that we seem to be taking an interesting tour from death and darkness towards light in the course of the evening. So that should put a nice light to it. I'm going to introduce the books and the names of our presenters by the order in which they appear. Briefly by name, there's too many prizes and teaching and research prizes in the table, so I won't be saying any of those. It's just overwhelming. I will be taking the evening, but I will introduce you first, and then we'll go on for the conversation. We are going to start with the book titled The End of Landscape in 19th-Century America, published by the University of California Press by Maggie Cao, a recent fellow here. She is now an assistant professor in the art department in the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It will be followed by a response by Elizabeth Hutchinson, an associate professor in art history at Barnard College and Columbia University. Afterwards, we will move into the shadows with the book titled Grasping Shadows, The Dark Side of Literature, Painting, Photography, and Film, a book published by Oxford University Press by Bill Sharpe. It's his sixth book, if I have counted well, and also a former fellow here at the Society, a professor of English and the American Studies program at Barnard, and more recently a Fulbright visiting professor at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. After Bill's presentation of this book, we will hear from former fellow as well, Daniel Harkett, an associate professor in the art department at Colby College, who will be responding on the shadows. And then we will end with a book about light, I believe, titled Georges Delatour and the Enigma of the Visible, a book of Fordham University Press by Dalia Judovitz, also an alumni. I believe that you were in the same cohort, and I believe it's also your sixth book, if I have counted well. So same, there might be some challenge and visible challenges that are going on. She is currently a National Endowment for the Humanities Emeritus Professor of French and Italian at Emory University. And also, perhaps also in the light of this being your sixth book, there might be some hope on us that the more books you publish, the closer you get to enlightenment. So we will end up with a response by Richard Brilliant, Professor Emeritus of Art History and Archaeology, and Anna S. Karbidian, Professor in the Humanities here at Columbia University, and not just any former member of the Society of Fellows, but a director of the Society of Fellows. So
I have no book, however.
but you'll have, I think that there's enough there, and I'm sure you will illuminate us.
That's all proof of their value. I have no proof of that value.
Because we want to make sure that we get to the light at the end of the tunnel, I like that you keep your responses to the time, and I'm just going to be here gesticulating and telling you to stop when it's time. I do gesticulate sometimes without me, so I'm going to do it in order. And we will open it to the floor at the end for questions. And with the logistics out of the way, we're going to have the celebration start. Congratulations for your books. And Professor Cao.
Thank you. Thanks, Maria. And still great to be back, everyone. It's great as usual. All right. I mean, I only have one slide, and I know hopefully it's on its way. Okay. judge my book by its cover. This is the image on the cover. So long before this book was a book, before it was a manuscript with my editor, before it was a dissertation at Harvard, before it was any of those, it was a project with a kind of cover image, which is this one. What you will find and see here is Martin Johnson Head's Gremlin in the Studio. It's a small 1870s oil painting. Head was known for painting salt marshes, these kind of very intimate little panoramas with grassy expanses, with some subtle haystacks and other details. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't realize. I forgot we had microphones. Sorry about that. So I'm just talking about this painting up here. So that is what you see, one of these marsh paintings. That is what you see on the top half of this canvas. The rest is, quote unquote, the studio. And you'll see in that lower section some crude sawhorses propping up the canvas and a little cartoon-faced stick figure grinning. And I haven't even gotten to the best part, which my favorite part about this painting is that at the center there's actually you'll see that the painting is actually leaking. So there's a little cascade of water coming down from the edge of the canvas, puddling on the floor. So no wonder this stick figure is bemused, right? And in a way, that little figure there is witness to a kind of end of landscape, the title of my book, because the landscape is kind of being drained away of its very lifeblood, both the marsh and the painting of the marsh, if you will. So trust me when I say that this is a really surprising, very conceptual painting for the late 19th century. And it's a kind of underdog type of painting because it's not canonical at all, and it's easily overlooked even if you're walking through the gallery in which it hangs. So, and over the years I've become a great believer in this painting and a great defender of it as well. And once I gave a talk and someone in the audience insisted it couldn't possibly be from the 19th century. So for me, this little painting justified my very uncertain was a kind of justification during my uncertain graduate school years that my hunch, the hunch that the veritable American landscape tradition of the 19th century was in a kind of crisis in the 1870s, had some legs, or at least some stick figure legs. So. This painting isn't how my book began, but it was a kind of keystone for me, locking together disparate artists and practices, because it's so purposefully turned landscape painting, that very celebrated genre, into a joke, a devastating but funny one. So if my book has any a voice, I would hope that it channels that little gremlin in Martin Johnson Head's painting. And I think I'll just turn now to reading some of the prologue section of the book to give you a sense of what it's about. No doubt when you approach this volume, you will have a healthy dose of skepticism. Does landscape really end? Given its centrality to photography, film, land art, and conceptualism during the last century, there is no doubt that landscape, as an artistic practice, has demonstrated remarkable resilience, and I do not set out to prove otherwise. My aims, in one sense, are modest, to show that in the late 19th century United States, both landscape painting and actual landscapes were vulnerable, and that this shared vulnerability is particularly revealing of the ways American landscapists reevaluated their genre. While landscape painting survived into the 20th century, its ideologies of a nationalism tethered to nature were on life support by the end of the 19th. Landscape increasingly lost its ability to sustain its earlier cultural function as the spatial, economic, and environmental conditions of American land became incompatible with existing modes of representation. Such cultural and epistemic shifts in American art were bound up with the fate of actual landscapes, which in the same period came under threat from railroad companies, real estate moguls, and land engineers, eager to transform Indian territories into tourist parks, squatters' refuges into ornate estates, and wetlands into dry earth. By the end of landscape, I hardly mean to suggest the extinction of an entire mode of artistic practice.
Rather, I want to evoke the high stakes of landscape at a specific turning point in American history. The definitiveness of the word end is deliberately designed to provoke. Herein also lies the broader goals of this book, those that go beyond a reassessment of 19th century American painting. Writing about the dissolution of a major cultural project is not without its challenges. Scholars have long favored beginnings, the emergence or invention of aesthetic traditions, which mirrors our own endeavors, of course, to innovate and break intellectual ground. The history of American landscape art is no exception. Its cultural emergence has no shortage of historical narrators. This book sets out thus to problematize endings as we do beginnings, to treat them as particularly revealing historical moments. The decline of aesthetic traditions is often a tale of slow dismantling rather than apocryphal break. It tends to be easily quantified. But how then can we qualify aesthetic decline? This book offers one model for doing so, one that privileges aesthetic peripheries rather than centers, and that grants the curious and unorthodox their due. For it is in these overlooked practices that a tradition's conventions are most subject to doubts and revision. Each of this book's chapters detail an artistic struggle where landscape runs counter to the emerging conditions of modern life. A famed artist explorer credited for opening the American frontier to aesthetic consumption faces its imminent closure. An overshadowed artist experiments with depicting wastelands and non-traversable terrain. A penniless painter of nocturnes attempts to make sense of the boom and bust market. And an artist naturalist tries to come to terms with the troubling implications of a Darwinian worldview. The artifacts born of these artistic struggles are a curious array of objects. Among them are butterflies that the artist Albert Bierstadt made by folding and imprinting random paint strokes. Salt marsh panoramas that Martin Johnson Heade, you see that here, transformed into dripping trompe-l'oeil still lives. Forested views that Ralph Blakelock rendered into million-dollar banknotes. And mountain vistas that the artist Abbott Thayer constructed solely from bird feathers. Though seemingly far from conventional landscapes, these artistic projects hinged crucially on the parameters and conventions of the genre and mediated landscape's relationship to major historical changes of the period. And rather than treat such artworks as mere oddities or one-off eccentricities, I have chosen to highlight practices at the productive peripheries of genres and disciplines, borders between landscape and still life, painting and commodity, art and science. The undoing of landscape takes place at these aesthetic limits in the form of artworks that were hardly landscapes at all. Only at such limits did landscape become a site of profound interrogation of modernity's spatial, temporal, and relational challenges. As practices about failure rather than invention, this book's limit events are regularly punctuated by negative trajectories, misunderstandings, and dead ends. Often, despite their humor, they are sites of contestation and mourning, tinged with anxiety and infused with sorrow. Indeed, landscape's failure was double-edged, at once pleasurable and melancholic, a revelry in decay, but decay nonetheless. Such ambivalent works rely on what I think of as failure as method. The end of landscape, as it turns out, is filled with artists resorting to futility and sabotage as pictorial strategies, deploying absurdist humor and exuberant excess to address the fears and anxieties underlying the end of a terrestrial era. Their artworks imagine forms of dripping and fragmentation at the very moment of landscape's dissolution. Indeed, as we have here, they sometimes actually self-destruct. So I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to Elizabeth.
Just read another few pages of her book. You'd get maybe more out of that, but 8
minutes is not enough time to either summarize the contents of this book or fully articulate its contribution. So instead, let me mirror the richness of the end of landscape in a series of associations. One might be suspicious of a book which tries to draw so much in, even when it's trying to tackle something as complex and entangled as modernity. Early in the book, we read that, quote, landscape painting, more than other cultural practices, mediated the American encounter with geopolitical, environmental, economic, and scientific modernity. That's a lot. And she goes on. Underlying this argument is the assumption that much of 19th century modernity was spatially oriented, making representations of land a particularly relevant subject through which to confront the modern. Like modernity, Maggie's argument is spatially oriented. And she grounds, and a sensitive attention to the objects of study grounds this book's claims. Each argument is generated by visual analysis that brings the reader richly into different kinds of pictorial formlessness and helping us see, or labor to see, what happens when the earth is folded, when proportion is, dare I say, blown out of proportion, or when figure gets completely absorbed by ground. I found in the chapter's cyclical journeys out into diverse fields and back through the artworks an affinity with the expansive quality of Vittorio de Palma's Wasteland, a history. Both argue for landscape's essential embeddedness in overlapping regimes of value and demonstrate a confidence in the historical viewer's sophisticated understanding of this fact. The careful attention Maggie gives to the distinctive pictorial logics offered by the works of Bierstadt, Heed, Blakelock, Thayer, and Sargent model a kind of art historical participant observation, not one in which the historian is remaking the picture, but a slow recreation of how we make sense of landscapes that bend or break the rules. For some reason, this book made me think of Clifford Geertz's thick description, that description which, as Wikipedia tells us, results from a scientific observation of any particular human behavior that describes not just the behavior, but its context as well, so that the behavior can be better understood by an outsider. Geertz's method invites a transcendence of mapping meaning onto the object of analysis, allowing the logic of its own semiosis to emerge. And though she doesn't cite him, she doesn't cite any of the people that I associate with her, but I think that's actually kind of a good thing. Though she doesn't cite him, Maggie brings a similar sensitivity to the work at hand as a means of uncovering their significance as something more than failed or irrelevant examples of the exhausted genre called landscape. Geertz's fame rests in a reading of a Balinese cockfight. Maggie's probably lies in her interrogation of Ralph Blakelock's painted currency. But each of the objects she analyzes has its own logic, the unpacking of which demands an understanding of the artist's artistic and life circumstances, the pictorial conventions of competing strains of visual culture, photography, stereography, maps, atlases, and diagrams, and a sense of the cultural moment, largely as experienced by people whose relationship to the landscapes in question is mediated through representation and investment, not direct corporeal engagement. These last qualities, of course, frequently are offered as hallmarks of modernity, that a consumption of the world as image. Not that landscape representation has ever been disconnected to concerns about ownership and investment, of course. While I am impressed at this book's meaningful use of research and theory from a range of disciplines, it is most pointedly an intervention in the history of American art. As such, it contributes to a generation of scholarship that moves away from proving the worth of American art vis-a-vis the European tradition to articulating significance in relationship to a modernity in which the U.S. has always participated and helped define. As a story of genre decline in the face of modernity, Maggie's study recalls J.M. Mancini's forceful pre-modernism, art world change and American culture from the Civil War to the Armory Show, a book that similarly takes up a bunch of also-rans to tell a story that upends our received wisdom about how aesthetic epochs shift. Mancini's argument is that modernism did not result from the innovative work of avant-garde artists, but rather emerged as the result of changes impacting the viewing public, who began to experience an openness to abstraction around the same time Maggie notes landscape reached a breaking point. Bringing Mancini's story of origins into view along Maggie's of decline allows us to better understand the challenges involved in developing art that is well adapted to the conditions of modern life and the failures that accrued along the way. Reading this book in the age of Donald Trump, I was perhaps most impacted by Maggie's presentation of fragility as the key component of both artworks and what they represented. The precariousness of landscape as both genre and material reality, she writes, was a preoccupation for her artists. It was something they both fled and reinforced by making works that themselves were delicate or prone to decay or to otherwise disappear. Her interest in waste, ruin, parasitism, and dissolution feels very timely, as we are daily reminded of the precarious state of aesthetics, environment, and economics, due in no small part to their entanglements. Thanks.
Great. I'm going to push the button. Space bar.
Do you want to use this? No, would you rather use this?
Is that like
easier?
click it?
Yeah. Just the down arrow.
Okay.
So it might be easier.
Down. Okay. Hello, folks. I'm delighted to be here. I just calculated on my fingers that it's 35 years since Dalia and I were sitting around this table as new fellows. Actually, a little more than 35 maybe. And my career began here, and if it weren't for the Hyman Center and Mellon Foundation and so on and so forth, I really wouldn't be here today as a professor writing books and so on. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thank you very much. Oh, we didn't have microphones 35 years ago. All right. Hello? Who? Yes? No? Maybe?
No.
Can I just speak up? Will that be all right? Yeah.
Your century now.
All right.
Which everybody.
Okay, I'll tell you about my book, Grasping Shadows. I had a few basic ideas that I wanted to include when I wrote this book. I was fascinated by shadows. They're absolutely everywhere in modern culture. It had been 20 years since anyone had written anything about shadows, and a lot had happened. And particularly, I wanted to come up with a theory of shadows that would address not just shadows in little dark corners of our history, but would address shadows in mass culture, popular songs, street art, and so on and so forth. I focused mostly on art history because that set the terms for shadows as we know them visually, but a lot of things have happened since photography came along and film came along and so on. And so I wanted to see if I could come up with a general theory of shadows, because everything that had been written about shadows up to the point had been about particular shadows, either as visual devices or about making certain thematic points. And I thought, what about every single shadow? Is there a way to think about them all? Well, maybe. I'll have to find out from the respondent whether I succeeded. Anyway, the basic fundamental confusion that we as humans have is whether a shadow is us, our shadows are real, and they have personalities and they express things, or whether they're just immaterial nothings that just lie there and will change and disappear. If we stab a shadow, will it injure us, or won't it? If we step on our shadow, what will happen? And so on. People have feelings about shadows, strong feelings about shadows. And one of the things I wanted to do was to recognize that a lot of our thoughts about shadows are not just visual, obviously, but are cultural. And so therefore, this is the first book about shadows that it integrates the literary aspect of shadows as well as the visual aspect. I'll just talk about the visual tonight just because it's quick and easy to do, or relatively easy. Okay, shadows predict, right? Shadows tell us things. Tell us that Anakin Skywalker is going to become Darth Vader. Shadows reveal things. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? They know that politicians want to become kings. The New York Times had this picture of the shadow of Donald Trump over an editorial a few months ago that suggested he was becoming like Caligula, that famous Roman emperor. a little bit more out of the limelight, but nonetheless, this is the official presidential portrait of Bill Clinton. Right before he died, the artist Nelson Shanks revealed that the shadow that is in the corner there under the mantelpiece and under the plant is not cast by the plant, but was cast by, oops, a blue dress.
Nasty.
The artist felt that he needed to break up the line of the mantle. He had the plant, there wasn't a good shadow. He went to his closet, he looked for something, he saw the blue dress, he thought, aha. And he put that in there and he said, let's face it, it's a metaphor, there's a shadow on the presidency. So shadows have a lot of resonance. Another starting point for my project was quite simply the fact that shadows can come on, can be attached or disattached, right? The most famous shadow we know of is Peter Pan, right? The shadow comes off. Doesn't happen in real life, but it happens in art all the time, where shadows can be detached. You can plan your film noir if you're a film director by thinking of the shadows first and then putting in the people to cast the shadows. Shadows don't necessarily come with an object or come after an object, they can come even before an object. Therefore, we have to recognize that every shadow that we see in cultural circumstances, artistic circumstances, has got some sort of artistic validity and is planned there. Biographically speaking, it was really important to me to learn about these shadows because I was studying painting at the time and really wanted to know how to make better shadows. And so that's what really made me aware of how arbitrary and difficult shadows are to create. This is the first painting that really takes the shadow seriously. And St. Peter is casting a shadow that is going to heal these lay people here. But it's not much of a shadow because for most of history, shadows have been confined to subordinate in painting so that they won't fall on people, particularly above the waist, and therefore mess up the clarity of the picture. But people also had trouble learning how to do shadows and deciding when shadows were important. So a few years after this, we see Giovanni di Paolo, who had put shadows on his palm trees in the background, but doesn't put any shadows on the Holy Family as it flies off into Egypt there in the foreground. Here's a really interesting moment in shadow lore. This happens when Luca Signorelli, by now he realizes that as an artist he has to put in shadows. But he's illustrating the very moment in Purgatory when the dead souls look at Dante and say, wait a minute, you don't belong here because you're casting a shadow. So Dante's got a shadow, but then so do the dead people. Because if you're proud of something, the pictorial necessity outweighed the actual text that he was illustrating. Jan van Eyck came up with something really amazing at the same time that St. Peter was healing with his shadow. He painted shadows in his picture, shadows that are shadows of, supposed shadows of the frame he's casting. But this altarpiece was in a chapel right beneath a window, so it looked like the daylight was casting the shadow into the space of the picture. So in a sense, contemporary light in a Flemish city was casting light that was the light that was holy light at the moment of the Annunciation. So he created interpenetration of religious and secular space. Rembrandt painted a self-portrait with shadow on his vision to show us, in a sense, the way he looks at the world. And he is really one of the great pioneers of shadow painting. The Night Watch is really interesting. Rudolf Arnheim discusses it in Psychology and Perception. He points out, we have to know a lot as human beings to evaluate this because there is a shadow here that is on a man. It doesn't belong to that man, right? The shadow belongs to the hand, but that hand is far from the shadow. So what's that shadow doing there? Well, the answer is, if you look at it, think about it a minute, that shadow is showing us that the leader of the Night Watch has got power and authority in that hand. But what does that power turn into? Physically, it has to be backed up with something. And so the shadow hand is reaching for the spear that the military leader of the Night Watch is holding. Now, in my research, what I finally decided was there are basically 4 shadows. I walked around Morningside Heights for years trying to figure out if there were more than 4, but I could only come up with them, and so here we are. The first shadow is a vital shadow. It expresses the inner being of something. We're very familiar with the idea that a shadow is a soul. But this is also tied to a story that really suggests that art history, that art itself began with drawing a shadow. The ancient Greeks and Romans believed that this story was more or less accurate, that that's where drawing begins. And in a sense it makes sense because shadows translate a 3-dimensional world into 2 dimensions. So here's the story from Pliny, heavily illustrated in the 18th and 19th century. But even before Murillo did it, but he did something interesting. The story tells us that it was a woman who was doing the drawing. But male artists couldn't accept that for very long, and so now we have a man drawing a man's shadow. 19th century comes along, things get more complicated. We have an art director twisting the woman's head. We have a man with a pencil in his hand. But then in the 20th century, the version of this shifts again, and now we have shadow tracing as a woman-to-woman operation. The men are just left out of it entirely. So there are different ways of going with that story. The second sort of shadow that I noticed, and there are many different other ramifications of all of these, but I'm just pulling out a few, I call a look elsewhere shadow. It's a basic, ordinary shadow that basically says, don't look at me, I'm insignificant, look at the thing that I am making look more real. Velázquez is known, amongst other things, for creating an art of the imperceptible shadow. You look at Velázquez, you never look at the shadows. They're so subtle, and yet they're so convincing because we're not seeing them. They're there, but in a sense, they're not there to our perception. They function like shadows do in real life, which is to say, we just see them, we throw them away because they're helping us figure out how the world is set up. But the look elsewhere shadow has other functions. I traced it in the book into Christian typology and the notion of foreshadowing and narrative foreshadowing. Here in visual art, it can take the form of this anticipation. A young man is trying to persuade this young woman to marry him perhaps before he goes away to sea. But what he's pointing to accidentally, the shadow suggests that a mother and child is going to be the result of his special plea. Similarly, this is an incredible foreshadow from the Victorian period, where you see Jesus getting up after a hard day in the carpenter shop, and he stretches, and his mother, who's been looking through the trunk and looking over the gifts that the wise men brought, saying, wait a minute, and she sees an image of the crucifixion. But look elsewhere shadows function really interestingly in a certain branch of modern art that has come from the last 20 years, which is using real shadow as an artistic material. In this kind of situation, we look back and forth from the shadow to the things that cast the shadows. In this case, it's a pile of junk. Real life is rubbish. This couple collected all of the household rubbish from the previous year, glued it all together, and created an object that which, if you shine a light on it, would produce a picture of them looking rather despondent, as if they felt that real life really was rubbish. The third kind of shadow takes us into imaginative realms, and we come up against shadows that can be separated from their casters, Peter Pan being an example. And there's a famous story that goes, it's very popular at the beginning of the 19th century, the story of Peter Schlemiel. He sold his shadow to a man who pretty much represents the devil. And once he loses the shadow, he gets a big pot of gold, an inexhaustible purse. The problem is, no one will have anything to do with a man who has no shadow. They don't want to deal with it because shadows represent that intangible something that makes a human human and worthy of respect and attraction and so on. He can't find a woman to love him. He can't find a servant to respect him. He can't find a way to go out in the daytime when the sun's shining because people will just shun him because they fear there's something wrong with him. So shadows are important. Shadows tell us whether or not somebody is alive. Here's Delacroix's version of Hamlet's father's ghost. The ghost has a little bit of a shadow at his feet, but it's clear that Hamlet has the big shadow because he is living rather than dead. Here's Peter Pan getting his shadow reattached because he needs that shadow. He needs Wendy to come into the picture to reattach the shadow because she's going to go and tell the stories to the boys in Neverland. She's going to put the whole package together for Peter. Robert Rauschenberg seemed to have done away with shadows and objects and everything in 1951 when he took some household paint and a roller and just created the white paintings. But his friend John Cage said, what you've done is you've created airports of the lights and shadows. Now your painting is a receptacle for shadows. And Rauschenberg himself said, when I exhibited, you can almost tell how many people were in the room by looking at the painting as a receptacle. But the artist Mark Tansey didn't agree with this interpretation at all. Felt that basically people like Rauschenberg and the abstract expressionists were throwing away their heritage as artists. And so he drew a picture of a man rolling over his own shadow, and what's underneath there is actually it's the Last Judgment of the Sistine Chapel. And the man is rolling all over that in the name of being a postmodern artist. Finally, the last shadow is an independent shadow. It's a shadow that exists without a caster. We see it in pictures all the time, but it's actually relatively new in terms of art history. And it goes back to this painting by William Collins, Rustic Civility. We see the shadow of a horseman who's come to a gate, and these little kids have opened the gate for him. So we're in the position of the people who are doing it. So we're like the gentry who may buy this picture, and the kids are nodding respectfully to us as we pass to the gate. The guy was much taken with this, and so were lots of other people. This is one of the more famous, he said, imitations or follow-throughs from it, where we see the crucifixion, but we don't see the crucifixion. We just see the crosses. Jericho picked up on this in a really interesting and menacing way in a lot of his pictures. The photographer Lee Freelander takes mostly pictures of his shadow on various things. So he's made this, in a sense, part of his trademark, but it also suggests the powerful and somewhat threatening quality of the artist. And then, of course, in films, we see this all the time, because a shadow can be much more interesting and gripping, watching the shadow do something, than watching the thing itself. There are shadows. Shadows are really important these days in street art in all sorts of different ways. But one of the first ones that did this was Richard Hamilton, who went downtown and created shadow men all over the place, created a lot of fear, which he wanted to do. And that's it. So there's one more autonomous, independent shadow there at the end if we look at, which represents the author in some respect.
I share the general delight of being back in the Society of Fellows here. I started as a fellow 14 years ago, and I loved it. I have to say it was a fantastic experience. Though I still think this building is impossible to get to. I was reminded as I was walking across campus. But yeah, it was a lovely experience. It also gives me great pleasure to respond to Bill Sharpe's remarkable book today, which offers us a guide, as he said, to what he calls a world of shadows. This is a representational world, a world of culture that encompasses cave paintings, Renaissance pictures, shadow theatre, and film noir, amongst many other forms. It's a shadow landscape, to use another of Bill's apt descriptions, that's so often unnoticed, yet profoundly constitutive of what we do see. To read Bill's book is to be invited to look again, to see the world differently by paying attention to structures of absence. My own experience of reading this book was utterly absorbing and also oddly disorienting. It was in an almost sort of too perfect recapitulation of the frequently imagined connection between the shadow and the unconscious. I must admit to dreaming about magic lanterns after one reading session of the book. So you never know what might happen if you dig in too deep. In my waking life, I found familiar artworks were made strange as my focus shifted to their shadows. This week, for example, I was teaching, as I have many times, Jacques-Louis David's Ode to Liberation, which you see on the screen there. It's a didactic picture that wants to tell us about the primacy of duty through a story about three brothers who fight for Rome, knowing to do so will tear their family apart. I thought previously about the general contrast between the light foreground and dark background as a device David used to ensure his figures and their gestures stood out clearly. This was especially important in the visually congested space of the official Salon exhibition where David sent his picture and wanted to impress the crowd. It's on the back wall in there, somewhere you can find it if you look hard. But Bill's book helped me to think about the roles played by the cast shadows of the foreground figures in creating meaning in the picture. The resolve and the solidarity of the three Horatio brothers, for example, is not only expressed through their parallel gestures, but also through the merging of their shadows into a single shape that echoes the head of the spear one of them holds. The cast shadows of the three brothers and their father also partially obscure the women in the picture, whom David imagines as denizens of an emotional private sphere that must be subordinated to public priorities. The women's disempowered situation is reflected in their inability to cast shadows of their own. What Bill calls the vital shadow, the shadow that expresses something important about its caster, here does the work of patriarchy, reinforcing the picture's gendered dichotomy of active men and passive women. Bill's book, with its careful descriptions of different ways in which shadows can work narratively that he just took us through, thus acts as a key that can unlock meaning in the most familiar places. As I was reading Bill's book, I also found myself thinking about the modern museum and its complex relationship to shadow. Indeed, one general area that I imagined it would be interesting to develop Bill's analysis of painting, photography, and film is architectural history and its relationship to the shadow. The image that you're looking at on the screen is a picture from the moment of the birth of the modern museum in the West, the moment during the French Revolution when the Royal Art Collection of the Louvre was opened to the public. Hubert Robert, a painter and a curator at the Louvre, here shows us not the museum as it looked, but his vision of a future Louvre in which skylights had been cut into the roof of the main gallery. Top lighting, in Robert's rendering, removes as much cast shadow as possible, creating a viewing environment of controlled neutrality and managed enlightenment that was to become a museum standard in the modern era. Recently in my own work, I've been thinking about a quixotic early 19th century French project to create a museum of porcelain copies of European masterworks, one that would, it was hoped, preserve the Western canon to the most distant centuries, in the words of one supporter. There were high hopes for copies of porcelain. In some of these bright copies, which are imagined to materialize the museum ideal, it's as if shadow has been banished altogether. And you can see an example of one of these porcelain copies with the original copy, obviously, is on the right-hand side of the screen. The utopian no place of the museum, set apart from time, cannot, it would seem, accommodate shadows. In his book, Bill discusses the way that at various moments in the Western tradition, divine figures are defined by not casting shadows. Perhaps in its shadowlessness, the ideal modern Western museum is assimilated to the divine. Yet at the moment of the birth of the modern shadowless museum, there was an equally strong renewal of interest in shadows. And you can see this in the popularity of nocturnal torchlit tours of sculpture galleries, for example, such as the one that you see on the screen when Napoleon is looking at the lab one with Josephine by torchlight. You can see this renewal of interest in shadows in alternative museums that evolved alongside the modern museum we're so familiar with, museums that accentuated rather than suppressed the shadowy. On the screen is a painting of a room in the Museum of French Monuments, a museum founded during the French Revolution that created atmospheric period rooms with fragments taken from churches and other sites of revolutionary violence. In the 1820s and 1830s, one of the most popular and modern attractions in Paris was the diorama. And at the diorama, visitors would enter a theatre-like space to view a picture that would change in front of their eyes. The moon might emerge, for example, to illuminate a ruined Gothic building. What you're looking at on the screen is a painting by the founder of the diorama, Louis Daguerre, that gives you a sense of what those diorama pictures would have looked like. The originals don't survive. Spectators at the diorama were given the opportunity, which they took enthusiastically, to absorb themselves in the shadowy scene. What Bill offers us in his book is a framework for interpreting the meanings that shadows contribute to artworks, such as in the Oath of Horatii, and also some ways of thinking about what attracted viewers, like those at the Museum of French Monuments or the diorama, to the world of shadows. Indeed, a certain kind of pleasure lies at the heart of this book. Bill is an enthusiastic collector of shadow stories, which I think came across in his presentation that he just gave. And he invites curious readers to join him in a community of shadow seekers. His reader is not necessarily imagined as a scholar, but as anyone with what he describes as a creative or critical spirit. And for me, this is exemplary academic writing. It's deeply researched, it's generative, and it's engaging for a wide audience.
get started. I don't know. Is it working? Yeah.
No,
Is it working? Okay.
yeah.
I'm very grateful to be here. This is a wonderful event and a wonderful opportunity also. Okay. It's wonderful to be here and have a chance to see old friends and see how well the society is prospering. Celebrated for the aura of mystery attached to his works, which were rediscovered only in 1915, Georges de Latour, 1593 to 1652, continues to be subject of scholarly interest and public fascination. At first sight, his paintings suggest a veritable celebration of light and the visible world, but this apparent focus is deceptive. The familiarity of visual experience blinds the beholder to a deeper understanding of the meanings associated with vision and the visible in the early modern period. Challenging the supposed transparency and immediacy of the modern ideas of vision, this Baroque way of seeing relies on naturalistic depiction to further spiritual ends. Latour's pursuit of likeness between the image and the natural world bears the influence of Caravaggio and the Catholic reform's call for the revitalization of religious imagery. But as I argue as well, it represents a response to the death of the sacred image, martyred, in quotation mark, in the waves of Protestant iconoclastic revolts in the Netherlands and northern France during the second half of the 16th century. Closer scrutiny of Latour's pictorial corpus reveals everywhere instances of awareness and reflection on the nature of the pictorial image, its visual illusionism, deception, and potential for betrayal. And this is where my book sort of departs from a lot of approaches to Latour, which have been treated him as a more naive, kind of uninformed painter, because the level of self-consciousness and self-awareness is systematic. It is there in every and each of his works, so it is quite extraordinary. The depiction of a fly that has alighted on the bridge cover of the instrument in the hurdy-gurdy players, 1628 to 30, you have the designation there in Nantes, alludes to mortality and temporal precarity, while also serving as the insignia of trompe painting in a display of self-conscious pictorial mastery. The prevalence of mirrors, the play of shadows, and the ubiquity of the word signal an idea of painting that is vibrantly self-aware, encouraging reflection on the processes of its making by taking to task its visual character and conventions. If the visible presents an enigma in Latour's, by the way, here it is, you see the fly and the pictorial antecedent in Peter Christus. If the visible presents an enigma in Latour's pictorial works, this is because its ostensible naturalism figures a spiritual worldview that painting suggests but cannot show. Like the books, and I was starting out in literature, I was obsessed with why I became aware that reading and books are just prominent and they inhabit. Why would, to ask Garrett sort of Stewart, who wrote a very beautiful book on the look of reading, what would be the interest of reading? Why would this be of interest to a painter? And serve as a kind of object of a pictorial act. Like the books shown in his paintings asking to be read, his paintings are not mere visual depictions since they function as instruments of insight, asking to be read rather than merely seen. His works demonstrate that what the eye discovers in its attempt to understand what it sees is mediated by the intervention of the word. The duplicative powers of painting as a mirror of nature are repeatedly contrasted with the illuminative power of the word, with the Gospels described as a mirror of the glory of God. In the Education of the Virgin, the Frick collection, I picked a couple of images in vicinity so you can revisit them if you so choose. It shows a child learning how to read. What book is the child, Mary, reading? Presumably the text in question is the Bible, thus inviting the beholder to wonder whether Mary is reading the words that herald her sacred destiny. Quote, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bring forth a son," Isaiah 7:14. However, at this point in her life, Mary remains innocent and ignorant of the text message, unable to see and recognize herself in its pronouncements. Her spiritual illumination will have to await another scene of reading, that of the Annunciation, that through enunciation brought about the incarnation of the Word become flesh, enunciation. The legible here counters the lure of the visible, figured through the reading's power to transform rather than mirror reflections as in seeing. Latour's devotional nocturnes depict acts of spiritual reflection where darkness and light, and lots of shadows, become the vehicles of an encounter of the mortal and divine worlds. Latour's Repentant Magdalene at the Met around 1640 depicts Mary Magdalene's rejection of worldly vanities and turn towards repentance, marked by her discarded jewels on the table and floor. Existing for us, and I'm reprising, I'm echoing here, evoking Maya Shapiro on the profile, existing for us and for itself, in a space virtually continuous with our own, Magdalene's iconic profile mediates a passage between the look of the beholder and her look off into space. This traversal suggests an approach to the image as a portal that facilitates passage from the profane to the sacred and from sight to spiritual insight. The painting is dominated by an ornate gilded mirror showing a radiant display of candlelight amplified by lustrous gleams on the mirror's frames. Latour's treatment of light and its reflection serve as reminders to the beholder of the difference between the light of insight or spiritual illumination, lux, and the light as source of worldly illumination, lumen. This lavish mirror introduces through reflection a disjunctive alternative space into the painting. But to what end precisely? Duplicating the frame of the painting within the image, the mirror marks the crossing between the plane of outward reality and the plane of inner life. By functioning as a matter of transformation of matter into form, and also as an instrument of resemblance, the mirror bears witness to the presence of an immaterial reality in the visible. By alluding to the presence of the invisible in the visible, the painted mirror acts as a device that figures the potential crossover from physical to spiritual vision. The duplication of the candle and its flame by the mirror image within the frame of the larger painting also reveals a broader reflection on vision and painting, since according to Merleau-Ponty, I quote, the mirror image anticipates within things the labor of vision, end of quote. The crossover and reversibility of the candle into its mirror image relies on a chiastic movement which complements rather than merely duplicates ordinary vision. This crisscross structure and inversion of the mirror as a chiastic device provides a model for the workings of painting understood as spiritual practice. Namely, the mirror figures painting's duplicative powers along with that which escapes and resists through inversion the grasp of ordinary vision. Thus, in addition to figuring the labor of vision, this is reprising Merleau-Ponty, the mirror also serves as a metaphor for the labor of painting. Latour, while denouncing painting's visual conceits as a form of blindness for religious reasons, Latour also uncovers within a mute thinking that illuminates the labor of vision. By questioning the nature of vision and the visible, Latour's works open broader artistic and philosophical reflections on painting and its engagements with the visible world. Thank you.
Yes. I have no book here to show you, but one should have been brought here. That was published is past fall. And one is obviously very taken by the non-present. It's an issue of presence and non-presence that really has brought this group together. So I'm going to use it if I can. But before I do so, I would like you to realize I was brought up as a child in the Stone Age. And in the Stone Age, I would listen to The Shadow. I was delighted with it. And I understood that the Shadow knew things that I would never know. I still feel the same way. But the fact is that when I began to think about what shadows were, and whether they were material, whatever language I use as a young person, I began to realize that they left traces of the material behind. They were themselves traces of the material. And in many of these talks this afternoon, the issue of materiality and its representation surfaced over and over again. In fact, in a way, it's an old argument about the nature of representation itself. Certainly in the de la Tour paintings, and I used to fantasize that what would we think if it were not Georges de la Tour, but Georgette de la Tour? We'd have all sorts of other schemes to explain what is going on in what are essentially often very domestic settings. And we don't have to use Me Too as a theory upon our understanding. But I want to read something that Dalia's book led me to again. This is a recent translation, not that recent, from the book of Genesis, part 1. And the first 5 verses, and then the 14th, say as follows. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And then in the 14th verse he says, and God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and so it was. I'm thinking about the use of light in what you're saying, and about the nature of representation. Of course, the fact is, there in the paintings there are no lights. There is the representation of the light, which in fact casts no shadows itself, but the artist casts the shadows that the artist wishes to create. And in casting shadows, like the shadow that I listened to on the radio in prehistoric times, one heard not just a shadow, but a very resonant voice. So the shadow had a relationship with the resonant voice that was very real in my mind. As a child, I used to look around for the shadow, and for the person who used that voice, which was very distinctive, and I never found that person. I realized there was some mystery here. And maybe the employment of shadows, whether or not by artists deliberately or otherwise, is meant to be mysterious. That is to say, in a work of art, there always remains something that is unseen. And in the unseen nature of that work of art, one finds the representation of that which is unseen. Now, there's an old reference to this sort of issue, not just to a famous psychologist who said once, a cigar is sometimes a cigar, and it's not always something else. But Wilhelm von Humboldt, who's an author I often look to, wrote as follows. The fundamental problem which every artist has to solve is quite simply to transform the real in nature into a built, an image, built. Now, in dealing with the shadow and other aspects, as William was talking about, it seems to me a lot of this is Bildkraft. That is to say, manipulating images so as to cross the boundary between what is material and what is not material. And the representation of materiality becomes a very important aspect because that we live in the world. And by living in the world, materiality is the way in which we define our own experience or live it. And thinking about this, and especially during William's talk and also during yours, about light and the absence of light, or shadow, I was thinking about the prints that, for example, Redon made, and the extraordinary velvety blacks that appear in those prints. Now, they are, I mean, if I touch them, which of course one should not do, you ruin them, but if you were to do this, you can feel something that maybe evoke the sensation of the blackness of them as a material thing. I became aware of this one many years ago because I've always been interested in representation and what lies behind and in front of representation. and the notion of the image as having a behind and something in front, I think is very important to the way in which artists create form, is that I was in Sharpe several years ago in the winter, and the light was coming through the stained glass windows of the nave, and the shadows of light which palpitated in the air were material. I felt that if I reached out to them, in fact, I could touch something. Now, what I was touching, of course, was not anything at all, but rather the sensation of the light falling on my hand. And the word splash, which occurred to me in that experience, was a splashing of the light against the piers and pillars of the building. They seemed to be real, like, as if they were water, but they weren't. I got concerned about how does one make decisions about that which is real in the world which we experience, and how do we not make those decisions in favor of the immateriality of things. Well, when I got Dalia's work, I began thinking about not so much shadows, but light. The light that is represented, of course, with being an art historian, I also love Caravaggio and the Rubin and the things that went on in the Netherlands, and the fact that the Spaniards, particularly in the early 17th century, got very interested in not only shadows but things and the representation of things. But of course, they weren't the things on the painting. They were things, representation, I would say, things of things. And the thingness of things becomes the way in which you separate the image and its reference. And I think one of the interesting aspects of dealing with shadows and dealing with light is the relationship between the image you see and perceive because of your experience in the material world and the thingness of that which to which it refers. I like very much in your paper the image which I think is that one with the mirror. Now, one of the interesting, I'm not trained as a classicist, one of the interesting aspects of that is Narcissus looking at his image and losing himself in his image, knowing it is not himself, but looks like himself. Well, I have for many years been interested in portraits and the way in which portraits purport, if they are properly done, to show the image of a person, that aspect of an individual, not the exterior aspect of their appearance, but rather the inner nature. Well, the inner nature is invisible unless you put it there. A good portrait artist knows how to put that which is invisible and make it visible. In fact, in many of these papers, there is a discussion of the necessity of making visible that which is otherwise invisible, because we work in a world in which the relationship between that which is visible and that which is invisible is paramount. Now, I keep on looking for the shadow nose, and I keep on thinking, and I am delighted that you brought it up. I keep on thinking of it, and I remember that, in fact, in thinking about the shadow, and the shadow, I think I mentioned to William that there's a recent article in the Art Bulletin about Angler's use of shadows as a created thing. Now, anything that the artist puts on a canvas or creates is a thing that exists in its representational self, separate from whatever may be the materiality of the painting. And actually, in classical art, there's been an enormous change in terms of the interest in color. Color that is applied to sculpture. We were all trained, very much the legacy of Winkelmann, to think about Greek sculpture as white, pure white, the wonderful marble. And now we find, if we use microscopic investigation, that in the interstices of the crystalline structure, there is color. And that color once covered the whole thing. And you have to rethink the way in which the image appeared. Now, you could read these images because they were carefully carved in such a way that light, after all, and shadow played across the surface, because the artists, the sculptors, were well aware of the way in which shadow defined the three-dimensionality of forms in space. When there's light, I have planned this talk here this afternoon, not knowing everything else that was going to go on, except Dalia's book, to have the lights turned off. All the lines. If I had more than the little time, I would have developed a theatricality. But if all the lights were turned off in this room, except for the ambient light that might come through the windows, we wouldn't see anything. And it's one of the differences that takes place, I have learned only recently living in the city, which I do now, in Manhattan. There is not only always ambient light, there's always ambient noise. Always. Now, it's not very loud, but it's there. And the light itself is also there, even though it is not projected necessarily. I will say, in my own bedroom, when the car goes by, I'm finishing, when the car goes by, I can see through the Venetian blinds the light shifting across the ceiling, and I know it's shifting across the ceiling, but there's really nothing happening.
Or is it? Thank you all for your comment. I'm going to open it up to the floor. I'm going to say it's a fascinating conversation since you mentioned the architecture as you think about your question. You mentioned architectural history, which has its own tradition, but in architecture, when I was trained as an architect, like building light, it's not a sensorial thing, it's like a technical problem. And shadows, and not only just doing it in the building, but how you draw it in the drawing, like how do you design. So not only sort of a sensorial thing that has this connection with the materiality of it. And I was very curious, Maggie, in your talk you mentioned briefly about not only the end of landscape as a genre, but the end of landscape as a spatial condition in American culture. So I was wondering if you talk about that in your book as well, as sort of environmental reality that is happening at the same time.
Yeah, I do, and that's something that I think came to the book later than the more pictorial history that,
the more pictorial history came first, but then I came to realize it was so crucially tied to what was going on with actual land, and so I talk about things like reclamation of wetlands, which is a huge 19th century project on the East Coast and in California. That's like the beginning of agriculture, California agriculture dates at that time. And so when artists are painting that, certainly it was in relation to what was happening all around them when all of these, drainage, like the heat painting, all the actual drainage was going on around the ocean tidal areas on the East Coast. So yeah, it's a huge part of, it ended up being a much more important part of the project than it was originally conceptualized.
Right, so we'll take perhaps 2 questions. Or 1.
I might ask an old man privilege here. There is something I wanted to show, which is probably familiar to all of you. It's Jasper Johns' Target. Now, I have to tell you that if you were in a gallery and you saw it for the first time, one thing you would not do is get a bow and arrow and shoot at it, because you would know it was really an image. I was fortunate enough to be in the exhibition at the Jewish Museum when Jasper Johns first showed his work in New York. This is some time ago. We were all bewildered by what it was and what it represented, and why this representation was so familiar to us and at the same time unreachable. It's an issue that has surfaced here because part of it involves the hermeneutic of explanation, and it is something that you were dealing with extensively. It seems to me is an issue that really floats along in these papers that play here.
Yeah, it's a big topic. It really floats along, art history and even, literary history, a lot of the work that we all do in the question of representation. But perhaps is there any question sort of more specific to the books that we can?
I have one.
Okay, let's take the both of them perhaps together, and then we'll have the authors respond.
Okay, with respect to Grasping Shadows, I noticed that it covers literature, painting, and photography, and film, but there's a wonderful book by the late, great John Hollander, who was a scholar and poet at Yale, foremost poet, and titled The Substance of Shadows, which essentially reviews the entire history of the use of shadow as a trope in poetry. And if it's not on your bibliography, it should be. It's fabulous. And a very narrow, specific question about Georges Latour. And his painting of Saint Jerome, which just happens to be a theme or a topic of great interest to me, his germ significance of, translating the first Vulgate Latin Bible. But his right arm, it was almost like an optical illusion. It was so vastly distorted. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that, because I just didn't understand why the tour was representing Sandrum's arm in such a way.
Can you just hold it for a second? We're going to take the second question and then we'll just answer it together.
I have a question for Professor Sharpe. In your taxonomy of shadows, I guess I would say, you ended your discussion by talking about dioramas and Louis Daguerre, and I'm wondering if you have in your discussion of shadows, either more broadly or in a particular part of it, relationship between the use of shadows and depth in an image, or the relationship between the viewer and the image in something like a panorama setting where the viewer is intended to become part of that three-dimensional space.
Okay. So arm and space.
Yeah, I think it's okay what you were asking about the arm. What was
Yeah, it's just bizarre. Look at that.
Oh, you mean the way he's holding the crossbow?
From this angle, it looks like it's distended in some kind of optical illusion.
Oh, yeah, well, to me...
It's not a natural representation of an arm, right?
No.
So why?
And despite the naturalist, I mean, the story in some way is referring to the reason that Jerome is flagellating himself is that he took too much pleasure in basically Cicero, in the profane word rather than the Bible. So he's beating himself up. He liked literature in a certain way, preferred it to the sacred. So there's this kind of opposition. Incidentally, speaking of color, the drops of blood and the drops of paint, there's a kind of self-referential play that is taking on the brush. And to me, the division in a way between this kind of double gesture that is taking place in a way encompasses the spiritual division in a way in the sense of guilt of having taken too much pleasure in the profane and in a certain way not having turned early enough or not having given sort of the biblical work, the Gospels, sort of their due. So I take some of the awkwardness in the depiction, despite the overall naturalism of the scene, to be a reflection on that. And there is this story of reading, because I think there's something very interesting about the fact that the book is open, and in fact it's an invitation to read. The words are almost legible, and it is a way of telling us that reading is an affair basically of seeing on the one hand, but seeing across, or traversing in a way, seeing to actually be able to have some kind of a spiritual or be experienced, imaginative kind of experience. So for me, it's very important because it figures a different way of understanding the kind of seeing that Latour is interested in, this kind of crossing over, this traversal of the visible in some way, in a way of alluding to what is unseen and how the unseen in a way embraces the act of seeing.
Has anyone decoded the pages that are open on the...
No, it's fake. It looks like it's almost legible. The legibility is a lure. Seeing is a lure.
It's probably.
We're gonna.
Yeah.
So, Bill, your arms and.
Okay, two things. Both questions in a sense. The first question is just about literature in my book. There's a lot of literature in my book. I didn't allude to it tonight, but particularly in the second section, the second shadow, the nature of the elsewhere shadow, look elsewhere. The shadow that is not substance, the shadow versus substance equation or opposition is a huge part of Renaissance literature. I spent a long time talking about Shakespeare's sonnets, and also deal with poetry by John Donne. He has a wonderful poem with a lecture on the shadows, and Walt Whitman, and there's a lot of literature in there, and particularly there's a lot of Dickens in there. Dickens is fascinated by shadows, so is Joseph Conrad. So the John Hollander book is absolutely wonderful, and it's more thorough about poetry and shadows than anything else that exists. So it's glad you mentioned it. Regarding the panoramas and everything, I defer to my learned colleague who brought them up, because I didn't address that, and that question, your question is exactly the kind of question I like, because I don't have to answer it. The point is really to say, I want to get people thinking about shadows. I've done the best I could with the 500 or so shadows I stuck in my book, but there are many, many, many more in all sorts of different areas. And so if you're thinking about them that's all to the good. You've probably got an answer.
No, I don't think I do. I mean, it's more than simply.
Perhaps if we, yeah,
We
sorry.
could continue afterwards.
No, please finish.
No, I was going to say, I think the diorama is a fascinating example of the absorptiveness of shadows, the way that shadows are sort of deeply absorbing for 19th century audiences. It's an interesting.
But don't you think too that the viewing platform, which is supposed to actually take the viewer's body out of the scene, makes it more like a Dante experience, right? Like you're not supposed to have the body with a shadow, even as your detective. I think it's a complicated question because you're dematerialized in viewing a panorama, even as the shadows in the corner are.
I think we're gonna have to move on and pass it to the other room and find answers and to the questions that we don't know, answers to the new questions over drinks. I want to end by congratulating again our authors for the book, so please join me doing so. Thank you.